President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask consent to speak for as long as I may require.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the Senate's Majority Leader, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, will become the longest-serving Senate Republican leader in history, surpassing former Senator Bob Dole of Kansas. This according to the Senate Historical Office. Today is Senator McConnell's 4,179th day as Senate Republican leader, a position that he assumed on January 3rd, 2007, after Republicans lost control of both chambers of Congress. I'd like to take a few minutes to put Senator McConnell's leadership in perspective. That perspective begins in the year 1969. I was 29 years old and working in the Nixon White House. Senator Howard Baker, Jr. of Tennessee, said to me, "You might want to get to know that smart young legislative assistant for Marlow Cook." Marlow Cook was Kentucky's newly elected Republican senator. That smart young legislative assistant was 27-year-old Mitch McConnell. If anyone has known him for a long time, the evolution of Mitch McConnell's Senate leadership isn't hard to trace. To begin with, when he was 2 years old, the doctor said, "Mitch has polio." It's hard to imagine today how terrifying those words were for parents then. McConnell remembers, quote, "It was 1944. There was a serious epidemic that year all over the country, and the disease was very unpredictable. First, you'd think you had the flu, and a couple of weeks later, some people would be completely normal, and some of them would be in an iron lung or dead." He continued, "In my case, it affected my left quadriceps, the muscle between the knee and your thigh. And one of the great good fortunes of my life, my mother was living with her sister in this little cross points of 5 Points, Alabama, where there was not even a stoplight, while my dad was overseas fighting the Germans. And it happened to be 60 miles from Warm Springs, where President Roosevelt had gone to treat his own polio. My mother took me to Warm Springs," McConnell said. "They taught her a physical therapy regimen and said to do it 4 times a day to keep me off my feet. She watched me every minute. It prevented me from really walking. My first memory in life is when they told my mother I was going to be okay, that I'd be able to walk without a limp, and we stopped at a shoe store in LaGrange, Georgia, on the way back to Alabama to get a pair of low-top shoes, which were a kind of symbol that I was going to have a normal childhood." If one knows about the determination of Mitch McConnell's mother, it's not hard to imagine how her son, determined as a college student to be a United States senator, and did, determined to be his party's Senate leader, and did, and determined to hold that position longer than anyone in U.S. history, and has. This was an arduous 2-decade leadership journey. Chairman of the Republican National Senatorial Committee, counselor to Majority Leader Trent Lott, Majority Whip, Minority Leader, finally Majority Leader. As for his mother's example, this is what Mitch McConnell says, quote, "It sure had to have an effect on me, which was that if you stick to something, you keep working at it and giving it your best, the chances are you may actually overcome whatever problem you're currently confronting." A second leadership quality that Mitch McConnell learned early in a fist fight was not to be pushed around. According to McConnell, again, quote, "I was 7. We lived in Athens, Alabama, and I had a friend across the street named Dickie McGrew. He was a year older than I was and considerably bigger. He was also a bully, and he kept pushing me around. And my dad called me over and said, 'Son, I've been watching the way he's been pushing you around, and I want you to go over there, and I want you to beat him up.' So," McConnell says, "I went across the street, and I started swinging, and it was an incredible, and I beat him up and bent his glasses, and it was an incredible lesson in standing up to bullies. And I've thought about it throughout my life at critical moments when people are trying to push you around." As a junior senator on the Foreign Relations Committee, Mitch McConnell surprised colleagues when he sponsored sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. And then, in 1986, he voted to override President Reagan's veto of those sanctions. But these colleagues wouldn't have been surprised had they known McConnell 25 years earlier when he was a student at the University of Louisville. He remembers, quote, "The civil rights movement was the defining issue of our generation. Working as an intern in Congress during the summer of 1963, I got to see Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Then in 1964, I was an intern in Kentucky Senator John Sherman Cooper's office. Two important things happened in 1964, he said. Cooper was in the middle of breaking the Southern senators' filibuster on civil rights, and we nominated Barry Goldwater, one of the few people who voted against the civil rights bill. Honestly, Mitch McConnell said, I was mad as hell about it. And I was so irritated about Goldwater voting against the civil rights bill and defining the Republican Party in a way I thought would be unfortunate that I voted for Lyndon Johnson, which in retrospect was a huge mistake, but it was a protest vote. Senator McConnell's willingness as a college student to buck his own political party resurfaced 40 years later in his leadership on First Amendment free speech issues. In 2006, he cast the deciding vote against the adoption of a constitutional amendment to prohibit flag burning, when most Republican colleagues and almost all of his constituents had a different point of view. He argued that the First Amendment protects even personally offensive messages. And McConnell became the Senate's leading voice against restrictions on political speech under the guise of, quote, campaign reform, unquote. Again, some of his own party disagreed, including President George W. Bush and Senator John McCain. But he persisted, and on multiple occasions, the Supreme Court has agreed with McConnell's view of protecting political speech under the First Amendment. Mr. President, 2 of the 3 United States Senate office buildings in Washington, D.C. are named for Philip A. Hart of Michigan and Richard B. Russell, Jr. of Georgia, 2 senators who were never elected to formal leadership positions by their colleagues. Senator McConnell discusses leaders without portfolio in some of his writings, describing occasions when a senator assumes a major policy role outside of the confines of formal party or committee leadership. His favorite was Senator Cooper, whom Mitch has described as, quote, my role model as a young man, a man of great conviction, very smart. In his autobiography, The Long Game, Senator McConnell tells of when Cooper took him to the signing of the Civil Rights Bill of 1965, and later on of watching Cooper's principled questioning of the Vietnam War. Senator Cooper's example must have influenced his young intern's one-man crusade 20 years later against a repressive junta in faraway Burma. According to the New York Times on September 15, 2016, Senator McConnell has been a lead sponsor, the Times said, of every major sanctions measure against the Burmese government over the last 20 years. And he's worked quietly and tirelessly with several administrations to try to bring democracy to the country. Unlike South African apartheid, it was a totally unknown cause, his foreign policy advisor, Robin Cleveland, told the Times. He championed the cause of Burma's pro-democracy leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, who for years was under house arrest. In 2012, when San Suu Kyi came to Washington, D.C., as the new head of government, she traveled to Kentucky to thank McConnell for everything he did for us, she said, over 2 decades. That's a long time, she said. Of course, in order to be the Senate leader, one first has to be elected to the Senate. In Mitch McConnell's early career, one can find multiple clues that point to his fascination with political campaigns and the pugnacious style with which he wins them. Of course, an early signal is the fist fight with Dickie McGrew. Another, I was the only 14-year-old in America, he says, watching political conventions from gavel to gavel, and I began to practice the craft and see if I could get good at it. When he was elected president of his high school student body, he remembers, I was hooked. At the University of Louisville, he campaigned for president of the student council both in college and in law school, participated in civil rights marches on the state capitol. As president of the college Republicans, persuaded Barry Goldwater to come to campus to speak. He did learn the craft of politics, and he did get good at it. He's undefeated in his own political campaigns, winning 6 Senate races in Kentucky, more than any other Commonwealth senator. He's been elected Republican leader more than any other U.S. senator, each time unanimously. And he's been proficient in not just his own races. In 2010 and 12, the Senate Conservative Fund helped nominate Republican candidates in 5 states who lost the general election when a more mainstream conservative nominee might have won. So in 2014 and 16, McConnell organized an effort to defend incumbent Republican senators who were challenged in primaries. He was successful in every case, including his own primary. This is what he said: "We were not going to allow what happened in 2010 and 12 to happen anymore." And so we got the most electable people nominated who basically took them on. Because if you're dealing with a group of people who think compromise is a dirty word and who always want to make a point but never want to make a difference, the only thing to do if you want to win the election is to beat them. Mostly, Mitch McConnell's political skills were born of necessity. In July 1984, he was 34 points behind in his challenge to incumbent Democrat Senator Dee Huddleston. McConnell discovered that his opponent had been making speeches for money. Now, that was legal then, but Dee Huddleston had been missing Senate votes to make those speeches. So McConnell ran an ad featuring a Kentucky hunter with bloodhounds looking for Senator Huddleston to get him back to work. In another ad, the dog treed the senator right at the end of what became known as the Bloodhound campaign. McConnell defeated Huddleston by 0.4% of the vote. I've searched in vain for early clues to one more aspect of Mitch McConnell's leadership style: his parsimonious use of words. Sometimes he reverts to absolute silence. In his autobiography, he admits that he only speaks to the press when it's to his advantage. He also tells of when Microsoft founder Bill Gates visited him, and the two of them just sat there, waiting for one to speak, making others in the room uncomfortable. And another time, someone once told President George W. Bush that Mitch McConnell was excited over a certain vote, and President Bush replied, "Really? How could you tell?" Why so few words? McConnell's answer is, I learn a lot more by listening. And so frequently I start out by listening and think about what I want to say before I say it. You don't get in trouble for what you don't say. There's nothing wrong with being cautious about your comments. I certainly don't mind talking, but I usually like to know what I'm talking about before I venture down that path. In July 2014, when he was minority leader, Senator McConnell spoke on the Senate floor about what kind of majority leader he would be if Republicans won the majority in the November elections. His model, he said, would be Mike Mansfield, the Democrat who was majority leader 45 years earlier when McConnell and I were Senate aides. What I meant by that, he said, first of all, was you have to open the Senate up. The last year of the previous Democrat majority, 2014, there were only 15 roll call votes on amendments the entire year. In the first year of our majority, in 2015, we had over 200. Open the Senate up. Let people vote. Number two, we needed regular order, which means the bill is actually worked on together in committee, comes out to the floor with bipartisan support, and has a better chance of success. He said, the best example I can think of was the bill to rewrite No Child Left Behind. Law had proved to be unworkable and unpopular, and by the time it came out of committee, you had the Democrats and Republicans lined up. It went to the floor. It was relatively open for amendments. Not that absolutely everybody got everything they wanted, but in the end, it passed with a very large majority. President Obama called it a Christmas miracle, and the Wall Street Journal said it was the largest devolution of federal control to the states in a quarter century. The humorist Roy Blunt Jr., who grew up in Georgia, has written, quote, "You start getting into trouble when you stop sounding like where you grew up." The political corollary is you start getting in trouble when you stop coming home. This is advice McConnell's not forgotten. He and his wife Elaine go home to Kentucky almost every weekend. He has kept his eye on Kentucky matters, both large and small, including disposal of chemical weapons that have long been stored in the middle of Kentucky, enacting a tobacco buyout to help local farmers, support for the state's public universities, and his advocacy for workers at the Paducah gaseous diffusion plant. Kentucky anglers and tourists appreciate his helping to enact a law to require the Army Corps of Engineers to allow fishing below the dams on the Cumberland River. 20 years ago, he created the McConnell Center at the University of Louisville, attracting a bipartisan parade of national leaders to visit with 10 scholars chosen each year from each undergraduate class. Each year, Mitch McConnell buys 12 season tickets to the University of Louisville football games. He says, "I have some regulars. We go to every home game and occasionally an away game. We make a day of it. We go out early. One of my friends has an RV in the parking lot, and we will talk about it, what will happen in the game, and then go to the game, and then we'll talk about what happened after the game. And it's a complete, lengthy exercise and one of the great joys of my life." Mitch McConnell's University of Louisville honors thesis on Henry Clay tempted him to pursue a PhD in American history and a career as a professor. But those of us who know him doubt that he would have been satisfied interpreting the action rather than being in the middle of the action. But his devotion to American history and his understanding of the importance of the United States Senate as a unique institution in American life have contributed a valuable extra dimension to his Senate leadership. In a 2016 C-SPAN interview, he was asked, "What would you like for high school American history teachers to tell their students about the United States Senate?" He replied that the Senate has been the indispensable legislative body because that's the place, McConnell said, where things are sorted out, the place where only rarely does the majority get things exactly its own way, the place where stability can occur. And at a time when many Americans are not optimistic about a country's future, he was asked, "What would you want those teachers to tell students about their future in this country?" Mitch McConnell replied, "Because of our woeful ignorance of American history, we always think the current period we're in is tougher than others. We've had nothing like the Civil War period. We haven't had a single incident where a congressman from South Carolina came over and almost beat to death a senator from Massachusetts. America's had plenty of challenges," Mitch McConnell said. Tough challenges, world wars, depressions. This is a great country. We're going to deal with whatever our current problems are and move on to another level. And I'm just as optimistic as I ever was that this generation is going to leave behind a better America than our parents left behind for us. I thank the President. I yield the floor.